Welcome, welcome. We're letting people in. We'll start in just a few instants.
As Michael is having his morning coffee, as Michael is reaching us from Australia.
So we're building the audience right now. And maybe to have a few things to say before I give you all the microphone. Well, good afternoon and good morning to some of you. And welcome to this webinar on how to manage emotional exhaustion within yourself and others. My name is Luciane Fabien. I will be facilitating this session. Pour nos participants francophones, la conférence sera en anglais. Vous pourrez poser vos questions en français et je les traduirai pour nos panélistes. Some information before we start. Your camera will be turned off, except for us. You're invited to put your comments and questions in the appropriate sections, and we'll do our best to share your concerns with our speakers, that's for sure. Before I present you our experts, we sort of like to hear you, to start thinking about how you are. So if you're participating in this discussion, because this will be a discussion between Michael and Cal, so the subject must be of interest to you. So have you noticed any emotional exhaustion within yourself, your colleagues, your organization? So start posting this questions or answers or concerns, I would say. And so right now, I'd like to introduce to you our panelists, our experts, really. So two international experts on leadership, Michael Bunting and Cal Lemieux. First of all, Michael Bunting is based in Sydney, Australia. He's been implementing the mindfulness, the Mindful Leader program in Fortune 500 companies, including Novartis, EY, Hilton Hotels, HSBC, and others, to name a few. He's the author of several business bestsellers, notably The Mindful Leader and soon to be published, Awakened Minds. It's on this last book that Cal Lemieux is collaborating. And Cal Lemieux has a very rich business and consulting life on top of being an accomplished psychologist. And he's also a mindfulness teacher, so is Michael, by the way, and a speaker. He has started implementing mindfulness in organizations for the last 10 years. And now with Mindsmatter, he's taking it a step further as being the North American partner of the Mindful Leader. So welcome, welcome, gentlemen. First, a question for Michael. What prompted you to offer this webinar on emotional exhaustion of leaders?
So firstly, thank you and welcome to everybody. Thank you, Luciane, for a lovely introduction. Good morning, Carl. Good afternoon, good evening.
Good to see you again, Michael.
So I think for me, emotional exhaustion, just to redefine it for everybody, it's one of the definitions of emotional exhaustion is accumulated stress over a long period of time. And it's that experience where you just can't seem to feel well. You just can't seem to, you lose sense of purpose, you lose a sense of meaning, and life feels gray to dull and relatively unpleasant. So it's an exhausted experience, and you can't necessarily put your finger on, oh, it's because I had a rough day yesterday. It's more like a pervasive feeling. That's emotional exhaustion. And in the interviews that I ran for the new book, there were 26 leaders around the world that we interviewed, all very senior leaders. What was surprising about that was that all acknowledged that they're emotionally exhausted. They didn't use that language necessarily. They used words like overwhelmed, stressed, exhausted, lack of boundaries, treadmill. There was a lot, and also, interesting enough, the worst I've ever felt in my professional career was a very common observation. And so it became evident to me that, wow, okay, so these people are talking to me really honestly. I have a deep trust relationship with all of these people, and they're sharing that they're emotionally exhausted. On top of that, a lot of leaders are pretending they're not, because that's the leader role. So the leader role is, I need to be strong, I need to be positive, I need to be. And so what's really interesting is this phenomenon where a lot of leaders are feeling exhausted, but they're pretending they're not, and they're keeping upbeat because they think that's what you're supposed to do as a leader, which then creates a whole raft of other problems in the whole workplace itself, and particularly for direct reports, and inadequacy, and eventually a whole bunch of imposter syndrome and image management, which adds to the problem. So it was at that point I thought we really need to talk about this, particularly around the facade that so many people put up and getting through and back behind the facade. So that's
Thank
my
you.
first.
Yeah, you were less, but you're concise this morning. It must be because you're in the morning. So Carl, what about you? So what have you found in your experience with leaders and your clients, really?
Yeah, and my turn to say hello to everybody, and also to Michael, getting the chance to chat this morning. I've been noticing this for, unfortunately, a little while. And I switched my career. I used to do more classical, classic management consulting, strategic planning, etc. And I was seeing, even like 10, 12 years ago, if not more, I was seeing leaders increasingly getting overwhelmed by work, increasingly having trouble to gain perspective in their decision making. Offsites were getting shorter and shorter, having more and more time and more trouble to book sessions to have more perspective taking type of reflections with senior leaders. That was absolutely necessary for them to maneuver in times that were then already getting more and more challenging, more and more competitive. This VUCA world that we often talked about had already begun. So I've noticed that for quite a while, and every time I thought it was going to be okay. I think we've reached about a plateau, and we weren't using the term emotional exhaustion there. We're just talking about people burning out and just disengagement and just people being overwhelmed. But what I've noticed is in time, it's gotten to a breaking point. Like obviously the whole last year we've had with COVID and all the stresses that come with it, all the ambiguity, etc. It's like we're reaching an end. We're reaching, well, we get the feeling we're reaching in, hence the exhaustion part of it. So increasingly focusing on shorter term, just trying to get your head out of the water, trying to get through your emails, trying to get things done that are like in the immediate, to the detriment of the longer term perspective taking, finding time to just recover. It's a bit like somebody who's trying to run a marathon with a strategy of a sprint. So obviously that, that won't work. So it's like we haven't yet adjusted to the world that I don't think will slow down all that much, even post-COVID. So that's what I've been seeing. It's pervasive. It's in every industry that I've looked at. I'm not saying the other ones aren't. There are ones that are doing well and are under control, but I'm not having a chance to be in contact with those.
Thank you, Cal. You were talking about image management, Michael, and because I have a public relations background, of course, it doesn't sound very good when you say they're busy doing image management, but what's wrong with image management in your perspective?
Okay, so I just want to qualify, because there's sometimes when people dial into these webinars, we've had some, people share with us afterwards. I just want to share that we're not going to talk about the standard stuff you can just Google. So in other words, how do you deal with emotional exhaustion? You get proper sleep. You look at your diet. You eat in a healthy way that does, especially late at night. Don't eat late at night because that interrupts your sleep. So you get good sleep. You have a healthy diet. You exercise, the obvious ones, right? Or, you know, you see a therapist if you're really struggling, right? Or speak to a friend, and then you get some movement. You get some kind of exercise daily. If you get, you know, those basic hygiene factors, you can just Google like how to deal with stress, and you'll get those out. And that's why you wouldn't want to sit on a webinar for that, right? So we regurgitate some basic Google stuff. So we're not saying those are not important. They are very important, and they should be looked at. What we're looking at is a little bit more of a subtle topic, which is about the mind, and how the mind, you can be getting decent sleep, you can be getting good diet, good exercise, and still be very emotionally exhausted and overwhelmed, because there's this other thing that creates so much problem, and it's called the mind. And unfortunately, good sleep doesn't fix the mind. You know, it doesn't fix your mental habits, nor does good exercise, nor does good food. It doesn't change the way you think. That requires a different skill set, and the way you think and the way you process the world has a huge impact on your well-being. So much so, one of the studies from Harvard would say 90% of your happiness is dependent on how you think and how you process the world. So coming back to your question of image management, for most human beings, it turns out that we don't believe we're enough or worthy. We somehow feel that there's something about us that's not, that's worthy of hiding. And then what we create is an image of ourselves, a story about ourselves. And then we sort of try and promote that story to ourselves and to others. And it leads to a very deep, the sort of the great secret of the corporate world, global corporate world, is the imposter syndrome. So again, you know, so one of the greatest privileges, and I'm sure you agree, Lucienne and Carl, I think one of the greatest privileges of our job is that we get to see behind the curtain, like the Wizard of Oz. Is that a lot of people in the corporate world, they only get the image management from bosses and colleagues. They get the Instagram version of their colleagues, and what we get is the truth. You know, where people build trust with us, it's our, you know, one-on-one settings, even in group settings, people finally share, you know what, I'm exhausted. I'm not pretending anymore. They take the image off. What's left in behind that image for most people is a sense of I'm not enough. I don't know enough. I'm not good enough, and I'm going to be found out, i.e. imposter syndrome. That imposter syndrome creates amazing amount of energy. We take up amazing amount of energy managing that image. So much so that if you look at Robert Keegan from Harvard, his estimate, and I think it's a very conservative estimate, is about 1/3 of a person's energy and time in the average corporation is chewed up by image management and politics, sort of managing how I look. And that means covering up weaknesses. It means sometimes claiming credit, sometimes not speaking up in case I show that I don't know. It's overdoing things to perfectionist degrees. It's the gossiping circles, because I don't want to confront that person because then they might not like me, but I still want to get things done. So now I've got to like pretend and so on. And this whole image management process chews up our well-being, chews up organizational trust, chews up a range of things. Now, our audiences that we've run webinars for, you know, I can't see the chat function, by the way, just technically, I wish I did, but it would be great to ask the audience, you know, in your estimate, if you can put on in the chat function, what percentage in your organization do you think is chewed up in image management? So, you know, again, as I say, it's in politics, in hiding, in pretending you know when you don't know, you know, in gossiping, in claiming credit, all of that stuff where it's basically a failure in genuine honesty and failure in genuine vulnerability. You see the 80%.
So yeah, we're seeing 80%.
Yeah. So what we're seeing is, even these first two observations, is that we're seeing this consistently in large corporations around the world, is that people are saying maybe half of my energy in the organization, half of the energy, just repeat that, half of the energy is being taken up in this. And the impact it has on well-being and connection in the organization is astonishing. I had a personal experience of working with someone, a client contact, who was very heavily in image management, and I didn't trust them because they would say things like to make me feel good, and then they would do different things. And I noticed my own, even despite all the skills, my own mental well-being declined in that period. It was tough to stay well. So that's more or less what image management is. And then we've got this additional thing now, what I'm calling emotional image management. So now, not only are we managing our image in terms of, you know, my competencies and how I do things and how I look in the workplace, we're also trying to show up as emotionally well. Like, I'm great, how are you? I'm well, I'm strong, I'm okay. But actually, very few people are okay. And it's interesting,
Yeah.
what would happen if I share that I wasn't okay as a leader? Would I be disqualified from leadership? And research is not
Exactly.
no.
What about Cal in your, you know, we have this this image management that we were doing that was taking a lot of energy, but now with the condition, the world condition, it added pressure on top of the VUCA world you were referring to before. And so do you think it's because of that added pressure that no one can resist this?
Resist, it's getting harder and harder. It's like, you know, try to hold a glass of water in front of you. I've done that exercise often with people in a conference. And at the beginning, it's relatively easy. You know, a glass of water, it's not that heavy. But in time, it gets like it's unbearable. You just can't hold that glass of water in front of you anymore. So it's obviously, it's the notion, the fact that this is ongoing, this is enduring. And when Michael is talking about image management, which is a really strong component to it, but there's also this feeling of being overwhelmed about managing your image, but there's also some concrete stuff in our environment right now. You know, there's more and more emails, there's more and more information that needs to be gathered, there's a faster turnaround time. And what that is doing is, you know, I'm sure many of you have heard about the kind of brains that we have. We have two brains. We have an older mammalian fight, flight, freeze type of brain, and it's really present. It's not because it's called a mammalian brain that it's not occupying a fair amount of space in our brain, in our mind. So when we're feeling overwhelmed, well, that brain kicks in, what we call the limbic system, what Michael and I call the fast brain. And that generates all of these automated behaviors. You kick in to try to survive. So what typically happens? Well, I've got all this stuff, I got to work harder. So people are working longer and longer days, thinking that number of hours they put in will lead to higher performance. And studies are showing just the opposite. The more you work, the less efficient and effective you are. And then that becomes a vicious circle where you're getting increasingly exhausted. And being exhausted, you're trying to work yet some more to compensate by the fact that you're exhausted. So it's this hamster wheel that is just creating an environment where we're not getting out of it. We're just repeating the same patterns because it's the old brain that takes over. Now, what we know about neurophysiology is when the old brain kicks in, that limbic system, that fast brain, it actually shuts off neural conducts to the prefrontal cortex, the executive function. The ones that would actually be able to put things in perspective and say, you know what? It's not that bad. You know, that image management stuff, do I really need to worry about that? Shouldn't I worry about my kids and getting home earlier tonight and stuff like that? That part of the brain actually gets, if not shut off, slowed down quite a bit. So we don't have our full capacities. We don't have the full ability to observe the scene and really judge what is right, what's most important for us. So we lose touch with what's most important for us, and we just repeat, and we just try to get out of the rat race, and we never do because we're increasingly exhausted, so we're increasingly working hard, and then obviously the cycle just keeps going. So
I'd like to add to what you said, Carl, is what's really interesting is, and I'll give you in our world a couple of really simple examples, is when we meet leaders for the first time, one of my first questions we ask them is, so what do you stand for as a leader? Just a simple question, okay, what do you stand for? And I'd say 1 in 200 leaders, maybe 1 in 300 leaders can actually answer that question. So, you know, and then the next question I'll often ask is, okay, so you run a team or a division or an organization. So what are the 2 most important behaviors in your organization, your team? And again, you know, on that particular one, I actually haven't heard anyone answer that yet, clearly. And it illustrates this interesting phenomenon where we've forgotten to connect with the base foundations of what's important. You mentioned that, and then we get caught in all this activity. And then the activity can often be violating or working against what we find is important. And what's really interesting about that is that when we're not in alignment with what's important to us, we're now in a state of emotional pain. And when we're in a state of emotional pain and we don't know what to do with that, we keep going with the activity, because the activity masks at some level, puts us into a state of exhaustion and numbness where we don't have to feel the pain. And somehow the promise of all the activity is to relieve the pain. And so we really get caught, as you illustrate, we get caught in this amazingly destructive cycle where we kind of doing stuff that we kind of think's important, kind of like, but we haven't really clarified for ourselves, what's important. So if you had to ask that person who's working late hours because of image management, for example, instead of going to their family, if you had to stop and ask them, like, let's just take an inventory of what's really important to you. And if you had to put in front of them, is looking good for the next 3 hours and kind of impressing and protecting, is that more important to you than connection with your family? And it's true that most people would say, no, actually, the connection with the family, and this is more important. Then you ask, but why are you doing the opposite then? It's just so, this work is complex at one level because it's the mind. But at another level, it's so simple, isn't it? That's what we're inviting people on this webinar to consider for themselves as a beginning point. It's like, what's really important?
And the dilemma here, or the paradox, is that when having a nice glass of wine, chatting about this, what's important for you, people will tell you. But when you're because that you're in a relaxed state of mind, and you have access to your whole mind, and we don't all know it, but we have easier access to our values and what's important for us, and we're guided by them when we're in relatively, calm state. The challenge in today's environment with everything we just talked about is feeling hijacked, feeling overwhelmed, literally bypasses that part of the brain who has those answers, or the body. The body and, the prefrontal cortex has a lot of that intelligence, but we don't access it. And if we don't, and that's, we'll talk about probably solutions in a few minutes, but that's part of the solutions. If we have untrained brains. We have untrained brains to not only be clear on what's important for us, we have untrained brains to actually know what Michael was talking about, that image protection. And often it's very unconscious. We've got all these beliefs about ourselves and we're unaware of them, and they're actually holding us back. They're holding us back from having a more balanced life because we want to please, we want to make sure we're okay. Or we've got this belief that if we lose our job, our life is over, or if we don't do something, or we're going to lose our job. So there's these beliefs that are unclear. There's what's important for us that's unclear. And our minds are so busy, we don't have the ability to even see that lack of clarity on either side.
Can I give, sorry, to add to this, I'm going to give an example because it's very real. We're always trying to give very recent or living examples. I was asked to interview a CEO we've been asked to do some work with a CEO and his team in another country. And so in the interview process with the CEO, I said, tell me what you like on the best day of your leadership. And he told me, it was very inspiring. And I said, tell me what you like on your worst day as a leader. And he said, he kind of stopped and he hadn't thought about that. And eventually he said, sometimes I can be really short with people, maybe a little bit overly direct and short. And that's it. That was his explanation. It was about 10 seconds, right? Then he spent the next 10 minutes justifying and rationalizing why he should be short with some people sometimes. And at the end of it, I said, I just decided to go for it. I said, it's interesting that and basically the language I was using was, basically you've spent 10 seconds admitting a fault and 10 minutes image managing. You're basically telling me how really actually there's nothing wrong with what you did, even though it's a bad day, And then what was astonishing to watch when in the interview was that, like, we kind of moved to the next topic, and then he couldn't help it. He went back to the topic and he said, I just want to tell you something else about X person and why I was short with him. And I was like, hold on a second, what's going on? It's like watching an addict almost, right? It's like I have to justify and rationalize my behavior because there's some uncomfortable feelings going on in here. He's obviously feeling, I said to him, I'm guessing you're feeling a bit embarrassed or a bit ashamed that you do this. Yes. Okay, good. And now by doing all this energy and explaining and justifying, you're trying to medicate, in a sense. You're medicating, you're kind of dulling down the shame and embarrassment. And I said, but it's not helping you grow at all. Like, there's no shift in that. That's just chewed up energy to for no end. And one of our other team, Grant, he interviewed a leader, funnily enough, on the same day who did the same thing. His feedback to that leader, he said to him at the end of the interview, he said, I just want to give you some feedback. I would never want to work for you if you're a leader. I just wouldn't, because all I get is defensiveness. Now, what's interesting in terms of what you're saying, Carl, is that we have all these mechanisms in the old brain, defensive mechanisms, right? Like activity mechanisms in the brain. What's interesting about them is that they also are a really odd or primitive emotional pain management system. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if when he's rationalizing and defending himself, he's at some level managing his emotional pain, right? He's feeling ashamed and embarrassed. He admitted it eventually. And then by doing all this fast brain activity, defensiveness, storytelling, he even said sometimes I can go on a bit, and he's doing it. We are chewing up energy, not growing, not fixing anything, but we're starting to feel better. And I think this is the greatest challenge of our industry, and it's the greatest challenge most leaders face, is that when we take healthy choices. So for him at that moment, a healthy choice would have been to be curious and non-defensive, open. When we do that, when we come back to, if I asked him, is integrity important to you, for example, is growth and learning important to you? I'm guessing he would have answered yes in both instances. And then I would say, but then why are you doing all that defensive explaining? Because that's not what's important to you. You're going the opposite direction. And what that is emotional pain management, done in a very primitive, unconscious. And we all do this, right? Why do we turn on Netflix instead of meditating or going for a walk? Because it's a primitive form of pain management, right? And as you beautifully put, it's the fast brain. It takes us away, which is why, again, just inviting the audience listening to this, it's come back to this question, like, what's really important to me? And then do I have any actions that I can take to begin to align? But the interesting part about that, Colin, I wonder if you could say more about this, is the moment you do that, you're taking your medication away, and you're going to have immediate emotional pain. You're going to have, like, the first healthy moves are going to feel worse, not better.
Exactly. So that's where I find we need to better understand how the minds work. And we spend a lot of time, as you do, Michael, explaining it, because despite all the logic of what Michael has just explained, there's going to be another reaction. So it's not because we know it that we do it. And the more overwhelmed we are, the more emotionally exhausted we are, well, the more the brain is going to work in that automatic pilot that Michael talked about, just to relieve the pain. And relieving the pain may be, yelling after somebody. Relieving the pain may be, disengaging from stuff. Relieving the pain may be to do yet more work because you're afraid that if you don't get this thing done before tomorrow, people will judge you, etc. So you're using short-term pain avoidance or pleasure-seeking strategies, which serve that old brain. That mammalian brain is built to avoid pain or seek out short-term pleasures. So you're stuck in this loop. So all the good things we should be doing, we don't have access to it unless we train the mind. And that, I think, is something we'll be talking about in a few minutes.
Yeah, so you were talking about, guys, about this is not going to be a webinar how to get some sleep, eat right, but with your experience, and especially with the Mindful Leader and the programs you've implemented in large corporations, Michael, I was wondering, what are you giving besides the obvious? Like you said, you Google this and you will get how to ease your stress. But you're more interested in the development of the people with the leaders with your program. So talk to us a little bit about the strategies we can use to deal with emotional exhaustion. And after Carl will drop in.
Yeah, I think Carl, and I'm going to sort of thanks, Lucy, and I'll hand it back to Carl in a second. I think, again, it sounds trite or simplistic, but it's not. is asking that first question we start with leaders is, what do you stand for? That's the very first departure point. Or another way of saying it is, what's the talk you're trying to walk? Leaders need to walk the talk, everybody agrees. And then we say, okay, what's the talk you're trying to walk? And most people go shocked. In fact, the most recent groups we work with, again, in global multinationals, have all the group admitted they've never actually consciously thought about values as a living daily practice. They've kind of thought of it as a brand of themselves. Here's my brand. I am blah, but I've never thought about it as a call to action on a daily basis or a guidance. So they've never translated their values into daily behaviors. It's just not. And so my question always is, well, if you don't have a talk to walk that's genuinely precise and conscious, how do you walk the talk? And then there's this massive gap of gray that Carl has talked about extensively, where there's all this mess of my behaviors and what I'm actually doing. And then there's a kind of like, yeah, I'm pretty good. Like if you ask the average person, like, how often do you refer to your values and live your values? We found in our surveys is most people score themselves at 4 out of 5. Yeah, I'm pretty good at living my values. And then you say, okay, so what are they? And give me an example of how you consciously live them. And then it just drops down, bang, there's nothing. And you say, well, how is it possible for you to say that you're really good at living your values and your values based, but say that you believe that you're at 4 out of 5, but there's no clarity? How does, that's where we get really curious, like how's that even possible? And it's like you're fooling yourself. You've got this own image management story of yourself. And then that leads to the other question, which Carl's has touched on many times, is this ability to be self-aware, accurately, consciously, to observe and know this mind and body with a degree of clarity and accuracy. And that's the other common question we ask our clients, is if, we do an experiment, if we were all to be self-aware right now for the next 30 seconds, like let's all practice self-awareness, like, okay, try now, try and be self-aware right now. Like, what would you actually do? And again, this exposes this massive gap. No one knows what to do really. How do I be self-aware? And then we conclude, well, if you don't know how to be self-aware, if you don't know how to practice it, how could you regard yourself as self-aware? So what we've got is this combination where we start off with what's important, and then we work with how do I regulate and manage myself into living more consciously what's important. Now, that may be healthy habits, that may be leadership habits, but they're all intertwined. They're all one thing. If I'm not living in integrity, for example, and for most of us, we aren't, in various subtle ways, not obvious ways. We're not all lying and breaking the law. But for example, if you're conflict avoidant, you know what I mean? If you're avoiding difficult conversations, you're out of integrity. If you're thinking something about a person, but you don't say it, you're out of integrity. And as soon as we're out of integrity, the system, the nervous system, the mind is split. It's not at peace. It's not at one. And that's what we mean. There's subtlety to this work around values work. But in order to do all of that, you have to know how to manage your mind. You have to know how to manage your emotional world, because the unruly, untrained mind, or the unruly emotional world that we're not particularly skilled at, starts ruling our behavior and pushing us into short-term, fast brain activity. It's almost like it rules us, we don't rule it, which is a function of adult development. And that process of beginning to train the mind to be more conscious. I should say one more thing. I'm going to hand it to Carl, because Carl, I'd love you to talk about the process of training the mind. Is what's really interesting is we've run some big LinkedIn surveys, 50,000 view surveys, where we've asked people, were you ever trained to manage your mind and manage your emotional world in any of your education, like your schooling, university degrees, PhDs? Were you ever taught? And it's unanimous. No, people were never taught. So is it any wonder, as Carl put it, when the world gets increasingly pressurized and we don't know how to manage our mind and we don't know how to manage our emotional worlds, that we are all almost condemned to go towards short-term pain avoidant strategies. It's like, why wouldn't you if you don't know anything else? Of course you would. And so our work is about, well, there's an alternative, and there's a way, and it starts with training the awareness, training the mind. And Carl, I'll hand over to you about that process, because I know there's 2 steps, right? Stabilizing and the inside.
Now on this subject, you know, Michael and I are perfectly aligned. That's why we're working together. A quick reminder, like just when we say train the mind, why are we even talking about that? Well, think about it. One, the mind hasn't, the brain, I should say, that hasn't changed like in tens of thousands of years. All right, we have the same brain that we had when we were like hunters and gatherers. Now, just look at the complexity of the world we live in. So it really just was not structured. It wasn't. We haven't had enough time to evolve to deal with all the complexity we're in. So train the brain means bringing back a sense of agency, because how many of us, if we talk about emotional exhaustion, I think for most of us, it's because we're feeling overwhelmed, as Michael spoke earlier. Most leaders he sees, most leader I see, be it in psychotherapy as a coach, I have trouble getting like 15 minutes in here. I'm lucky if I could, you know, pick them up in 2 weeks for 15 minutes. Your agenda is like booked solid. And even if you're not a senior executive, I think you know what I mean, that we have incredibly busy days. So the brain has just gone into automatic pilot. It just does what it needs to do to get through the brain, to get through the day. What I'll often ask people is, what's the difference between the mind and thoughts? Is there a difference? And it's surprising to see that most people, actually it's the first time they think about it. And they start wondering, okay, mind, brain, they're probably the same stuff. Or some people may have an appreciation of it. But that's what training the brain's all about. And training the mind, more importantly, is you get to see the difference between your mind as an observer and your thoughts and all the narratives it creates. And you get to see all of those unhealthy reflexes you get caught into. You get to understand what are the beliefs, the mental models that are driving those different behaviors. So there's 3 prongs to it. One is, Michael put a lot of emphasis on that, and rightly so, is taking stock. What's really important for me? And I bring it one step further. So when we do values work, as Michael spoke, the type of work Michael does, as we do, and we often work together on this, is not only do we identify our values, we identify the values that will pull us closer to the person that we want to be. So that next growth edge in terms of what is important for us. So it keeps you focused, not on all the stuff bringing you down and all the negative bias that we have built into us, but okay, I want to be that person. I value courage. I value honesty. I value compassion for others. So that's first and center, and you're able to refer to it. The other side is we train ourselves to understand, bring awareness to what happens when we're not there. What kind of behaviors are we actually doing? If I say I want to be kind, and on the other hand, I say, well, I'm often yelling at people or cut them off, etc. There's a disconnect, but it's there. So, and often we'll just hide it because we don't like that part of us. So we learn to bring acceptance, awareness, consciousness to both sides of the equation. Clarity on where we want to go, but also clarity and acceptance on the kind of behaviors we have, and even deeper than that, what's driving those behaviors. So if I'm cutting somebody off, there's a belief behind that. Like, I don't have time to waste. If I don't get my job done, people won't appreciate me, so I might as well cut people off so I get things moving forward. There's always beliefs behind it, but you learn to see the contradiction and you face it. You have it in front of you, and then you're able to better maneuver it. You'll be able to accept those patterns that we don't like in ourselves. So another thing we bring in training, and both Michael and I do a lot of, is bringing self-compassion. Not being hard on yourself for not being the person you want to be. So on the one hand, what am I moving towards? On the other hand, what am I moving away from? And bringing consciousness to it. And across all of that, from the very beginning, is this thread of actually learning to train your mind through various techniques. Meditations are one that, you know, a lot of people know about, where you're learning to observe your thoughts. You're learning to focus. You're learning to stabilize and notice when you're getting, you know, caught into your automatic pilot, into that vicious circle we talked about. You're able to stop it. You're able to find techniques to refresh your mind throughout the day, and more importantly, train it on a regular basis so you actually don't get as emotionally reactive. So your brain doesn't automatically go as easily into that fast brain limbic system that brings all those short-term rewards or harm avoidance. So in a nutshell, that sort of summarizes, you know, the kind of things we work on. Please, Michael.
Can I add something there? Thank you. That's really enjoyed that explanation. So when you're talking about meditation or mindfulness practice, now again, for the audience, if you're new to it, mindfulness is not meditation. Like it's like going to the gym is not exercise. It's a form of exercise, but there are many forms, as in meditation's the same. It's not, mindfulness is being present, aware of in and out, right? And that meditation's like the gym in a sense for mindfulness. What's also really important, I'd like to add around that, is emotional management. Because one of the things that happens for all of us is that when we experience emotional discomfort, you know, fear, anxiety, anger, hurt, shame, these kinds of feelings, we don't have the ability to regulate our minds, we go to the immediate pain avoidance strategy. We can't help ourselves. And how does that look in terms of, and by the way, that also happens in the choice of values, and I'll give you an example in a second. But when we're practicing mindfulness, as you say, and stabilizing the mind, we're also learning to stay stable and accepting of difficult emotions. Because I mean, if any of you on this webinar have ever tried to meditate for any period of a week or 2 weeks, very quickly you'll meet discomfort. You know, where you put the timer on for 10 minutes, it feels like an eternity, and you're like, all you want to do is just get up and go do something else. What's happening in that process is you're feeling uncomfortable. You're not enjoying the experience. And then what we do is we look for immediate, you know, when's the bell going to ring, because then it's over, then I can be okay again. But as we train ourselves over time, we begin to realize that we can be stable, we can be well, we can be unmoved by painful emotions, and that's so. And we can also begin to explore our painful emotions in a much more constructive, curious, developmental way. What's so big deal about that is when if you have the intention to say follow integrity as a value, that what you'll find is when you're out of integrity, it's the behaviors you're choosing instead of integrity-based behaviors are basically those are pain management. So example, I value integrity and then someone's behaving in a way that I don't enjoy, or they're being disrespectful. I choose not to address it because addressing it would bring up a lot of discomfort and emotional pain in me, maybe in the other person. I don't want to handle that mess right now, so I avoid it. Whereas when I start training the mind to say, it's okay, I can be balanced, even in some discomfort, it allows and enables us to be much more courageous around living what's important. And then you get a virtuous circle, not a, you know, almost like Jim called a doom loop. So the emotional world is a very, very significant part of our well-being. And when we're not managing our emotional world constructively, it manages us. And it manages us into typically short-term destructive behavior. So you might say, like, let's get the, you know, it's like, let's go get our exercise, etc. But you'll find that often you can't really get your rhythms and routines right because there's discomfort in there that you don't know how to deal with. So you don't quite get around to your rhythms and your disciplines of eating well, etc.
Maybe just a quick add-on, because I think that's a super important point that Michael brought up, the whole emotional connecting with what's going on emotionally. And I would add one, connecting physically. We've also disconnected from our bodies. And a lot of the training we go through when we're doing mindfulness training or just overall mind training is learning to connect with the body, because a lot of the information is coming from there. A lot of the emotions have a root in some physical reactions, and that's often the entry point into noticing the emotions and the kind of thoughts that are generated from those emotions. So just a little compliment. And
then I just want to add on one last point. Lucianne, can I add one last?
Yeah, of course.
Just to, you know, Carl talked about you know, this importance of choosing something that's important to you, and I just wanted to highlight how dangerous or fraught that can even be, because and I'll give you an example. One of the senior managers in one of our groups said, he basically talked about the biggest problem he has in his team at the moment is a lack of accountability. Like, people are behaving badly and he's basically not really addressing it. And then when we asked him, okay, so what's important to you and your values, he was like, he eventually decided, well, kindness is my #1 value. Kindness is really, really important to me. And everybody in the group sort of collectively shrunk down and gone, oh my God, okay, here we go. Because what he's choosing is his value of kindness misinterpreted is kind of creating avoidance. He's being kind instead of honest. And now we now know, when you get more advanced, that to be honest is to be kind, particularly constructively honest. But it's very easy to even choose what's important to you as a way to reinforce your short-term, destructive behaviors, in his case, avoidance. So when he's being kind, he's being avoidant. So he chooses values that basically keep him safe in his locked up patterns. And it's amazing, the human mind, and how we are able to self-deceive even in the choice of our values, and how we can tell stories about how we're living that are just not true. I mean, to withhold truth from someone when they're behaving in a way that's not good for them or others is not kind at all. But often people who value kindness go, no, I'm being kind. I'm not really making them feel uncomfortable. I'm not addressing it. Well, that's not kind at all. But that's how the mind works. Even in the choice of values, the mind can deceive itself.
So I have a question here behind the concept of training the mind. So how would the participants start training the mind in a quick and easy kind of way?
First answer is no quick and easy. I think that's what everybody's looking for. No magic bullet on this one. And I think that's where we can start, just by at least exploring the mind in a rather quick and simple way. I know we'll do simple things like just observing the mind for 1 minute, guiding practices where they're looking at their minds for a few minutes. Now, the reality is to rewire the mind to, go into the direction that Michael was talking about, or that I may have talked about as well, is actually many months of actually taking time to not only around observing the mind, but getting to understand, how do I respond to the world? What kind of mental models do I have that make me interpret certain situations a certain way? Do I have these patterns and these beliefs that are fueling my stress, my distress, my view of the world, that's creating this emotional exhaustion? So you not only have to revisit how you're getting lost in thought to learn how to focus and have attention, you're also learning to identify what kind of patterns are actually present. And that just takes both, moments where you're actually training through notions like meditation is certainly one of the stronger approaches that we use, but also just in daily, we often just invite people, what we call informal practice, where you choose to bring a bit of more stillness, a bit more space in your life, because we're so conditioned to always be busy. We have 15 seconds. What will we do? We're going to reach for a phone. We're going to scan something. We're going to look for information. We're going to respond to somebody. And we've lost that ability or that reflex to sometimes just be with ourselves, see what's going on in our body. What kind of emotional landscape am I observing right now? How could I just slow things down? That feels weird. And every time we show people how to do that, it takes a while because they feel they're wasting their time. So there's a notion of just regaining the connection with your body, your emotions, your thoughts, and seeing that is not a waste of time. That is actually very constructive. It's like somebody who's training for a triathlon, who's training from morning to night. It doesn't work. You got to have these moments where you recuperate. You have to have these moments where you're able to observe what's going on in your body. So this is what training looks like. It's both some cognitive training on, what kind of mindsets do I have, both the ones I want to move towards and the one I want to move away from. You got to ask those questions. You have to work at it. You have to go test it. And there's some more, if I could say, concrete physical training as well around learning to focus, learning to have attention, learning to observe your thoughts, learning to be with what Michael talked about. It's so important. Learning to be with discomfort. And what does that mean to be with discomfort? I'm just going to, leave with that little introduction because I know Michael has a lot to say on this as well.
Well, I'm gonna. Thanks, Carl. I mean, that's a really beautiful explanation, and for the listeners who really want something like you can go and do like right now, pragmatically. I know that's not typical of me to answer. Like, here's the immediate, like, go do this, right? Here's the simple logic: is this: you're either living in your senses or you're living in the mind. You're either living in connection with the senses, you're listening, you're feeling, you're tasting, you're seeing, or the attention's taken away in the mind. So the most basic thing we all want is we all want a sensational life. All of us. We all want a connected life. Unfortunately, when you're in the mind, you need nothing sensational, and there's disconnection. So the most basic, as Carl said, the most basic training is to train yourself to be present with what's happening now. So, for example, if I'm going to be self-aware, I have to be aware to begin with. There is no awareness. The awareness is stolen away by the mind and the obsession with the mind, right? It's stolen away when we bury ourselves into sort of stimulated, numb activities. So how do I choose? I can deliberately choose to be more present. Is I simply can connect with the senses, and that's a classic meditation. But for those listening now, it's like, maybe, for example, if you just felt your body in the chair for a minute, or for a few seconds, you just register body, chair, weight, and then you register the feet. So for most of us, we probably haven't felt our feet for 1 second the entire day. It's like feet. And it's just like that registering of the senses. And then if you stay with the senses, and we've done this 1,000, 100,000 times, what happens is the mind starts calming and stabilizing. That's the senses. The senses are key. So if you're going to go for a walk and you want to like get a double, 2 for the price of 1, right? You want to go for a walk and look after your mind. Well, then when you walk, stay connected with the senses. Don't think about work and all that. All that thinking is what's destroying your well-being. So walk, but feel the footsteps. Notice the breeze. Listen, the mind wanders off. You keep training the mind to come back into the moment, and it's in the moment that our lives happen. So the most basic, it's a really basic, right, is begin to just keep bringing the mind back to the present. The present moment you do primarily through the senses. It's the senses, right? Carl talked about observing the mind. Usually in our training process, that's kind of more advanced. You've got to first be able to do the senses. And then when the mind is stable enough, it can begin observing the mind without getting swept away by the mind. So this first is the body and the awareness. And I think that's what I would say is where we start with the process. And how important is the body? Carl talked about the body, agreed, is the body always tells the truth. Always. The mind lies. So the body tells you when it's time to rest. The body tells you when you're out of line with your values. Your body tells you when your intention in a conversation is ill and not right. Your body tells you, when you're hiding something, or the body's always telling you this, but we've lost the understanding and the wisdom of that regulation. And it's when we disconnect from the body over time that eventually the body gets sick. The body rebels. We're not looking after it anymore. We think we can override our physical existence. You can't.
So you've done a little bit of work, a lot of work actually with organizations. What it may seem a bit not traditional in an approach, and I was wondering, what have you seen as business results, like organization results, when you did those train the minds of not you, but help train the minds of the leaders you did the programs with or coaching?
I'll talk about one example, and then Carl. I mean, there's so many examples, and then there's the evidence and the non-evidence. Our process is typically very disciplined. We measure everything. We measure the behaviors. So one thing we've realized is that you can't do a culture change through meditation. It's like, did you meditate today? Oh, okay. Well, you got your KPIs. It's ridiculous. You can't. But what you can require from organizations is behaviors. You can say, look, there's a couple of key behaviors, like not gossiping or telling the truth or taking accountability. These are behaviors that are essential to our strategy and our success and our long-term thriving in this organization. And you can hold people to account for those behaviors. Then all the mindfulness, self-awareness stuff's a gift, in a sense, to help people be better, to regulate themselves better, to do those behaviors that really are that critical for the business, for the health of teams, the health of the culture, attracting and retaining the best people. And our again, of the many examples, one easy example is one of our clients was losing 25% of their staff annually. We came in and did some work with them, basically exactly what we've described on the senior leadership team. And they went from that to eventually winning a global award or the best culture in their entire world, and their staff turnover reduced from 25% to like 11% in 2 years, and the mental well-being, etc., etc., etc. You know, profitability, the whole 9 yards goes up because you release. There's so much goodness in the organization. So we know it works, but there's a process, a disciplined process. And I think one of the biggest mistakes in our field, if there are any consultants watching this, is you can't put meditation or mindfulness as a strategy. It's not the strategy. The strategy is the behavior change. It's the behaviors you want in the workplace. That's the thing that a CEO can get their head around. It's like, yeah, there's, you know, if you ask any CEO, are there any behaviors in your business that you know are not serving the business, are not good for the business? Are there any behaviors in your team? They'll pinpoint them pretty quickly. You say, would you like to have those changed? Yes, that's the work.
Maybe to complement that, yeah, to complement that, I think there's an initial activity that needs to happen where people need to actually change their paradigms, because people are often in this mindset that more is better. The more we work, the more we'll get things done, etc. So, and how the brain works, etc. What we've found that works really well is a lot of education initially, so that we understand what's going on, and people actually realize that we need to create space, both individually and collectively. So, on top of what Michael mentioned, you know, being clear the kind of behaviors you want, there's also some rituals and some workplace practices that could be put in place. Some companies have put practices around not having emails delivered after a certain time, making sure people take their breaks or holidays, starting meetings with maybe a moment where they're just sharing, you know, sort of a temperature check. How are people doing today? So there's a series of rituals, of habits, of structural elements that align with the belief that the organization needs to get out of a conditioned culture of just this rat race, of just keeping the machine going faster and faster, because even the senior leaders, like the employees, are looking upwards saying, you know, we can't take any more of this, and the leaders are themselves caught up in this. So there's no ill intention anywhere. It's just we're all working under automatic pilot, under the assumptions that more will get us out of this. And what we're working with a lot of organizations is trying to start creating space in your own mind, so you have access to more brain power by slowing down that whole system, but also starting to create space in the organization to have moments where we can just chat, reconnect as individuals, because we know that creates resilience. Having moments where we have room for innovative conversations, you know, breaking out our current ways of thinking. So these are all things that the organization could start rebuilding back into their ways of working, because we don't see it anymore. So there's both individual behavioral mindset change and organizational change that needs to accompany it once people sort of understand where we're going with this.
So I'm hearing you, Carl, saying a bit like slowing down to accomplish more. Is that what you're saying?
In many cases, yes. When I say slowing down, we're not talking about taking an hour off, like in your day, just to do nothing. We're just saying bring more space. As Michael mentioned, you know, go into your body. That you're still working, but when you go into your body, when you go into your senses, you're just stopping that hamster wheel from spinning. And we know that a hamster wheel that spins too much leads to emotional exhaustion. So you have to embed in your day habits where you slow down the mental processes which are being conditioned by the world we live in, by the technology that surrounds us. So if we don't make a physical effort of doing that, if we don't train ourselves, if we don't put in mechanisms and rituals, it tends not to happen.
For the sake of sounding cheesy, you know, we did build an app for several $1 million spent that has all that training. So for those listening, there is, you know, you can see it in the behind the brand, that Awaken Mind there. You know, we spent a lot of time and effort building the trainings and resources to help people begin to get their heads around the logics, exactly what Carl's talking about, but also we've designed the practices so that people can, and if there's French-speaking people listening to this, it's also available in French and German and Spanish in a couple of months. So there is, you know, if you're sitting here going, I would really like to train myself, I'd really like to move towards Well, there's even programs on what we've talked about, fast brain, slow brain, and training and helping you decide what's important. There's even a program on the app for that, for helping you get your head around that and move forward. So there's a lot of constructive stuff that you can do in there, and you can just download it off the App Store.
I'd love
And
to add
there's
stuff, but
also-
I'm conscious of time, so I'll just maybe, yeah.
There's also, you had a presentation in August about emotional exhaustion, and there were, I believe, 2,500 participants. Was it in Asia or just Australia, Pacific, or?
Designed for Europe and Asia, because the time zones don't work, or Australia and US.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll make this available for all our participants, and we'll be sending you the link. I think you are going in much more in depth about emotional exhaustion, I believe, Michael, in your webinar.
I would say yes and no. I mean, I think the content we've covered today is also really, I mean, it sounds like we're just chatting, but there's a lot of content in what we've covered in the last hour, and a lot of key messages, and a lot of things that, you know, you could start with right away. But as I said, if you're feeling overwhelmed listening to this, but you're also recognizing, geez, me or my team can do something, we need to do something about this. You know, we need to give ourselves some basic training. You know, the next step, if you really want a low, easy next step, is go and check out, just download the app, and there's programs on the animated videos, etc. You can begin to just look at. That's a logical next step.
Thank you. Last words, Carl and Michael.
I'd want to thank Michael for showing up at so early in Australia time. It's been a pleasure connecting with all the participants as well. We're obviously around. We could reach out to us. It would be a pleasure to guide you in whatever needs may be emerging from this conversation. So thank you, Lucien, as well, for hosting this, and to all the participants and Michael. So good night to everybody, and good morning for others.
Thank you.
And Michael,
always the same words. When we are unwell, and that means emotionally and mentally unwell, our unwellness spills onto others. And when we are well, our wellness spills onto others. So please be well.
Wonderful.
thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Good night or good morning, everybody.